Welcome to the Art and Science of Mead. Mead Flaws and Faults, Troubleshooting, and How to Avoid Problems. This next presentation, Mead Flaws and Faults, is a topic that many of us really don't want to talk about. Because let's be honest, there are many other things that we'd like to think about when making mead, other than the many ways there are to screw it all up. But if you want to make mead that you'll be proud to share with your family and friends, or maybe even win a medal or two in competitions, you first need to know how to avoid all the many ways there are to make a bad mead. As a beekeeper, I feel that it's my duty to do the best I possibly can, working with an ingredient that's perfect as is, honey. But if I'm not careful, I can make a mead that is utterly undrinkable. On the other hand, I can also make a mead that is a work of art in the glass, something delicious to be enjoyed and to be remembered. I hope you find this presentation helpful in your journey to make the best mead possible. Well, here's an overview of what we are going to talk about. I'm going to review why is it important to understand mead flaws and faults, distinguish the difference between what a flaw versus a fault is, discuss some of the various categories of flaws and faults, and then describe each of them and go through how to identify what is the potential cause and how to prevent, and if there's a solution, what some of the possible solutions might be. Mead flaws and faults, how to detect, prevent, and address them. So why is it important to understand mead flaws and faults? Well, for one, in order to become a better mead maker, it is essential to be able to identify faults in your own mead. Now, this can be challenging. Sometimes we get a taste for our own meads such that we don't recognize problems within them. That's why it's so beneficial to send your mead off to competition so that it can be objectively evaluated, and that's why it's also helpful for you to judge or taste other meads, both commercial and homemade, so you can get an idea of what the various flavor profiles are and begin detecting some of the issues that, even if you can't explain why it is you don't like that mead or why it has a problem, at least get an idea that there is something going on that may be a problem. If you better understand the cause of the common flaws and faults, you'll be better able to address and prevent them, preferably early, before they are fixed and more difficult to get rid of. By recognizing mead flaws and faults, you can become a better judge. The best mead judges don't only identify the fault themselves, but they also offer some helpful feedback on how possibly to prevent it from happening in the future. So what's the difference between a flaw and a fault? Now, this is not written in stone. There's definitely a lot of overlap, and one could debate that this is a flaw versus this is a fault. But in general, a flaw is a minor departure from an accepted characteristic of a mead. Minor flaws are usually fixable, and the mead might still be drinkable. It's just not as enjoyable as it could be. Perhaps the mead is out of balance. Maybe it's too acidic or too sweet or not enough tannin or some other issue. A mead fault, on the other hand, usually renders the mead practically undrinkable. Something that might be a flaw, if it becomes excessive, could become a fault, and it's often impossible to fix a serious fault after the fact. Some examples might be mercaptans, ethyl acetate, and some of these other issues. Further, I'd like to put in a word about the Bjcp Mead Judge exam resources. There's some very helpful resources about Mead faults, open access online. They talk more about identifying the fault and what it is. This presentation is going to talk more about the causation of the fault themselves, not only identifying it, but also what techniques you might take to prevent it or address it. But nonetheless, this is a very helpful resource. Certainly if you're going to be studying for the Mead Judge exam, I encourage you to review it, but it's also very helpful for mead makers, even if you have no interest at all to become a mead judge. So what are the categories of mead flaws and faults? I lumped them together based on what the underlying cause was, understanding that there is a lot of overlap, and there's some flaws that don't fit into any other category specifically, or maybe they fit into multiple categories. First, there is the oxidative faults, including oxidation, volatile acidity, and acid aldehyde. The reductive faults, which are from sulfur compounds, including hydrogen sulfide, DMS, and mercaptans. Microbial faults, Brettanomyces, lactic acid, and other bacteria. Diacetyl, geranium taint, unwanted in-bottle carbonation. Environmental faults, where the mead was exposed to something that caused it to have some problems. Overuse of additives, perhaps someone wasn't measuring properly or went a little bit crazy adding acid or tannins. And then the miscellaneous category, which is probably the largest, and this includes faults that do not fit into any of the others. Perhaps there's multiple causes for them. And again, just to remind you, I put these categories together to make it a little bit easier to talk about the causes and how to prevent them, but there can be overlap. For example, volatile acidity, acetic acid from Acetobacter, or from from yeast under stress, that's both a microbial flaw and it's also an oxidative flaw, so you could put it in either category. Well, I'm going to go through each category, describe each flaw, how to identify it, what the cause might be, how to prevent, and then what possible solutions there might be, if any, available to address it if it happens. Well, let's start with oxidative faults. Too much of a good thing. Well, in mead making, we do want some oxygen early on in fermentation. The yeast needs some oxygen early on for healthy fermentation, but later on it can begin causing problems. Now, in some styles of mead making, just as in wine making, oxidation is encouraged. It's a style of wine making or mead making. The oxidative style tends to use open-top fermentation, also barrel aging. The reductive style of mead or wine making tends to try to keep the mead away from any unnecessary oxygen or air exposure post-fermentation, and that's through the use of closed-top fermentation, inert gases such as carbon dioxide, typically fermented at low temperatures, high acidity, and then the judicious use of sulfites to help preserve fresh aromas and flavor. Each style presents its own unique challenges and flaws. If you are too much over to the oxidative side, you might have problems with oxidative flaws, acid aldehyde, volatile acidity. And on the other hand, too far over onto the reductive side, you can have sulfur compounds, which is why you're not really fully or 100% over one side or the other. For example, I'm a reductive style mead maker frequently, but I still add oxygen early on during fermentation to optimize yeast health, and only am more cautious about oxygen exposure later on after fermentation is complete. Now, there's a myth that oxidation cannot occur in mead, and that is definitely a myth. It most certainly can occur just the same as it can occur in any other alcoholic beverage. Now, in some styles, slight oxidation may be a desirable characteristic. A good example are some of the aged Polish meads, where you want to have a characteristic like sherry or Madeira. In other styles, however, it can be unwanted. So it really depends on how much and what style of mead you're making as to whether this is a problem or not. There are two types of oxidation. There's enzymatic oxidation. This requires the presence of oxygen and phenolic compounds, and this is what causes browning in fruit-based meads such as piments and melomel. Think of the apple after you cut it and how it starts turning brown. Now, this type of oxidation does not occur in a traditional mead that does not have phenolic compounds. However, you can have non-enzymatic oxidation occur as well, otherwise known as chemical oxidation, which requires the presence of oxygen and results in conversion of ethanol to acetaldehyde, and this can occur in any type of mead, so in a traditional mead or any of the other types of mead. Well, one of the oxidative faults is when the mead turns brown or begins tasting like cardboard. It's from excess oxygen that was introduced using open-top fermentation for long-term storage, too much headspace, not enough care or caution when racking. Perhaps sulfite levels were not monitored and adjusted well enough. In order to prevent, you should add sulfites, monitor over time. I typically go through about once a month, measure, and then add more if I need it. Try to keep carboys filtered to the top, and if you can't, then purge the headspace with inert gas such as CO2. If it's mild, treat with sulfites, followed by fining with potassium caseinate and PVPP. I'll go over this in a little bit more detail here in a moment. But if it's more advanced, there's unfortunately no solution and you probably have to dump it. Another oxidative fault is acetaldehyde. The mead is nutty like sherry, sometimes with bitterness. What happens is the ethanol is converted into acetaldehyde by non-enzymatic oxidation, and often other oxidative flaws are present, such as browning. In order to prevent this, maintain adequate CO2, be careful when racking, purge headspace with CO2, and the solution is similar to other oxidation flaws. Treat with sulfites and then fine with potassium caseinate and PVPP. Ethyl acetate. The mead is like nail polish remover. This can sometimes be difficult to distinguish from Fusil alcohol, and they often occur together. It can come directly converted from the acetaldehyde, but sometimes it can be due to microbial activity, often acetobacter, but not always. It can often occur simply from yeast stress during fermentation. So to prevent, you try to avoid high temperatures and use nutrient additions, and then maintain adequate sulfites, purge the headspace with inert gas. And if advanced, there's not really a good solution for it. Inert gases, these are basically gases that do not have oxygen. They tend to be heavier than air, although nitrogen isn't. The most common that's used by home mead makers is CO2 because it's readily available. We often use it to carbonate our mead in kegs. It is potentially soluble, so it can absorb into the mead over time. Nitrogen has the benefit of not absorbing into the mead over time, but it has about the same density, so it does not, quote, blanket, unquote, as well. Of course, the blanketing with inert gas is really kind of a myth, especially if you have an open-top vessel. It basically will mix and flow out. Talking really more of a closed-top fermentation vessel, a carboy or a stainless steel tank, where you basically push in the gas for a period of time so that the volume turns over within the headspace, and then most of the oxygen and air has been pushed out. It's never going to be 100% unless you sit there for a long time. So we're not really blanketing, but rather purging or pushing out the air that was in the headspace. And then finally there's argon, which is thought to be the most effective. It doesn't absorb into the liquid. It's heavier than air, but it is more expensive. So when we're using inert gases, there are some safety precautions. The gas cylinders are under extreme pressure. That's why you don't want it to fall over, or when transporting it, you don't want to, put it in the back of your pickup truck and just let it bounce all over. It could possibly damage the stem valve. So put it in a place where it's going to be safe and not bouncing around. Be careful to not break the regulator or gauge when you're opening it. For the very large ones, this is really talking more about commercial meaderies. These can be pretty heavy, so you want to chain them to the wall or have some type of brace to keep them from falling over if they get bumped. With oxidative faults, as well as any other fault, prevention is the most important. It's better than trying to have to deal with it after it happens. So try to prevent unnecessary oxygenation during processing post-fermentation, such as when you're racking, filtering, or bottling. Try to fill fermentation vessels completely, or more commonly, at least for me, purge the headspace with inert gas. And this is not the same as blanketing like we used to talk about. This is basically trying to push in the gas, the CO2 or whatever you decide to use, for long enough so that any of the air that was present in the headspace has been pushed out the top, and then you seal the top so that no air can get in. Measure sulfite levels and keep levels adequate. At the minimum, the molecular sulfite should be 0.8 milligrams per liter, and that's going to depend on both the free SO2 and also the pH. I go over this in much greater detail in my sulfite presentation. So prevention is always best, but what can you do after you've detected some oxidation in your mead? Well, first I test the free SO2 level. More than likely it will be completely unmeasurable or very low. If there is some sulfites present, say it's 20 or 30 parts per million, then you might not want to add quite as much. But if the sulfites are basically unmeasurable or very low, I hit it with a large dose of 100 parts per million of sulfite. This sounds like a lot, but remember, this mead is already ruined and might have to be dumped out. So drastic problems require drastic solutions. Most of the sulfite that you add in this big upfront addition will disappear as it binds to acetaldehyde and oxidized polyphenols, and it also will scavenge any dissolved oxygen that's still present. And then I remeasure the free SO2. Surprisingly, sometimes there will be no detectable free SO2 even after having added so much sulfite up front. I'll hit it hard again with another 50 or maybe even 100 parts per million addition. Now, if there is some measurable, either to start with or after you've given the large sulfite addition, then I would not add as much, because you don't want to overshoot, of course, and cause yourself to have another Flaw, too much sulfites. Instead, I would add some sulfites, but try to aim for a level a little bit higher than you normally would aim for, maybe 60 to 80 parts per million, instead of the usual, say, 30 or 50 that we're aiming for, depending on pH and so forth. Then I find with potassium caseinate, and I tend to use a higher dose than usual, 3 grams per gallon. Again, this is not a time to be shy. You need to really be aggressive in trying to get this under control if you can. And then I often will follow that with polyvinyl polypyrrolidone, PVPP, which will help remove browning, especially in lighter colored meads and also fruit-based meads and melomels. After several days or a week or so, then I would rack it off of the sediment. And then I remeasure the free SO2 one more time, just to make sure that it's at least 0.8 milligrams per liter molecular SO2, because now that you've fixed it or helped it, you don't want it to reoxidize again. But when you go into this, you have to go in with the attitude that I may end up having to dump this anyway. So if this doesn't work, don't be afraid to dump it. But sometimes you can take a mead that's oxidized and make it into something that is, maybe can be blended into another batch or something like that. I have won a medal or two with some mildly to moderately oxidized meads that I treated like this, but most of the time you have to understand that the mead is never going to be what it possibly could have been had it never become oxidized and had to be treated like this. When you treat it aggressively like this, you're going to be not just removing the bad stuff, all the oxidized character, but you're also going to be removing a lot of the good stuff, some of the aromas and flavor from the honey and the fruit. But sometimes you do what you have to do to try to at least salvage it enough so that maybe you can blend it. Reductive faults. My mead stinks. So stinky mead. I think any of us who have judged mead in competition have come across some of these meads over the years. The easiest one to recognize is hydrogen sulfide, because that's like rotten eggs, but it can convert to other compounds as well. Hydrogen sulfide is pretty volatile, and under normal conditions it usually volatiles away while the mead or wine is fermenting. But some of these other compounds can develop from the hydrogen sulfide, and these other compounds that develop from the hydrogen sulfide may stick around and become a problem. And that's why if there is ever hydrogen sulfide present, it's important to deal with it early on before you get some of these other compounds. What are the causes? Well, hydrogen sulfide can form during fermentation, especially when there are nutritional deficiencies, such as inadequate YAN, yeast assimilable nitrogen. This happened a lot back in the old days before winemakers or mead makers knew about adding nutrient additions. It still happens now with maybe home mead makers who decide not to add nitrogen. Perhaps they're using raisins or some other form of quote-unquote nutrient that really is not a nutrient. It's really not enough to provide enough nitrogen for healthy yeast fermentation. Some compounds can later form from the hydrogen sulfides, including mercaptans, especially if the yeast is or the mead is left on the gross lees for too long and there's autolysis. Dimethyl sulfide compounds can come from metabolism of sulfur-containing amino acids or from oxidation of the mercaptans. Some yeast strains are more likely to be high sulfide producers than others. Some of them won't produce a lot of sulfite unless they're stressed or don't have enough nitrogen. That's why whenever I'm using a new yeast strain, I always look at what its nitrogen requirements are, and if it's a high nitrogen requiring yeast, then I'll make sure that I add a higher than usual dose of nitrogen addition, of nutrient addition. Here's a list and description of some of the faults. Again, hydrogen sulfide, most of us recognize. It's like rotten egg. Some of the other ones, the mercaptans, can be like rotten cabbage, asphalt, burnt rubber. The dimethyl sulfide family sometimes is more subtle. It's sort of like a loss of freshness. It's like a cooked vegetable or canned corn type of nature. Whatever sulfite it is, all you know is you just don't want it. It really could take a mead that would have been really pretty good and make it into something downright awful. Well, what are some of the potential solutions? Well, during active fermentation, if you smell even a whiff of stinkiness and you haven't added nutrients or you're about to add a nutrient addition, make sure you add some. Aerate the batch by racking or by bubbling in some O2. And again, this is during active alcoholic fermentation. After fermentation, it's a little bit more challenging. If it's hydrogen sulfide, you can aerate through racking, and that'll help with hydrogen sulfide, but not with mercaptans. With dimethyl sulfide, you have to scavenge the oxygen because these can be transferred into compounds that have less of an aroma that you might not notice until after it's in the bottle for a while. So typically you will treat with ascorbic acid followed by some type of copper treatment, and then mercaptans will respond only to copper only. Well, before treating your sulfide flaw, it's important to identify what type of sulfide you have, and this can be done with a bench trial. Now, it's really important to mention here, these are for smelling and not for tasting because you're going to be using a very high level of copper sulfate, and so you don't want to drink any of these samples. So you'll have 3 glasses with 50 milliliters of mead. Glass 1 will be the control, so that's the untreated mead that you're going to compare it against. Glass 2 will have a milliliter of 0.05 copper sulfate. That'll remove the mercaptan and also the hydrogen sulfide. And then glass 3, you'll add ascorbic acid first. That's an oxygen scavenger. And then wait several minutes. And then you'll add a milliliter of the copper sulfate. And then you'll compare these. So with a glass, you'll compare the glass 1, no treatment, the glass 2, copper sulfate only, glass 3, ascorbic acid first, followed by copper sulfate. If there's no change in any of these glasses, then whatever is a problem, it's not a sulfide problem. If there's no change in the first 2 glasses, but there's at least a reduction, if not elimination of smell in glass 3, the ascorbic acid and copper sulfate, then it's a DMS or disulfide problem. If there's a response in copper sulfate, glass 2, and then complete elimination in glass 3, then that's going to be hydrogen sulfide, mercaptan, and disulfide. If there's an elimination in both of the treatment glasses, then it's either hydrogen sulfide or mercaptan. It's very important to know because you want to know what you're dealing with before you start treating it. But again, these glasses for this bench trial are not to be tasted. They're only to sniff. Copper sulfate has been used for many years to treat problems with reductive faults and sulfide flaw. But the problem is it's potentially toxic. The dose has to be very small. There are legal limits for residual copper if you're a commercial winery or meadery. In the past, they used cyanide compounds to remove excess copper, but that's no longer legal for obvious problems. If it was overdosed accidentally, this could be extremely toxic or lethal. The copper, if you've added copper sulfate, you can decrease it with bentonite, casein, or yeast hulls. If you use it during fermentation, then much of the copper will be absorbed by the yeast, so it's less of a problem. And there are ways to calculate the 0.1 parts per million addition. This is just a little slide. But remember, if DMS is present, dimethyl sulfide, you must first treat with ascorbic acid, 2 to 10 grams per liter, with 2 treatments 24 hours apart, as this is an ascorbic acid. Vitamin C is an antioxidant, and it will be a transient oxygen scavenger. And because of that redox pathway, DMS might not be addressed with copper sulfate if there's any oxygen present. So you must always treat first with ascorbic acid, then with your treatment. Now, personally, I don't recommend the use of copper sulfate for treating reductive faults. I use it for diagnosing when I do the bench trial, but there's some other proprietary products that I've had better luck with. One of them is Regulus. It's a formulation of inactivated yeast developed by Lallemande. It doesn't have the risk of adding excess copper, such as copper sulfate. Bench trials are still recommended. Typically, you mix well, leave for a few days, and then rack off of the lees. And then another product, Coopsit, has 2% copper citrate coated with granulated bentonite. Usual dose is anywhere from 5 to as high as 20 grams per 100 liter, so that's about 0.2 to 0.8 grams per gallon. With severe batches, you might have to use as much as twice as much, and the reaction happens pretty quickly. And then after a few days, couple of days, you rack off the lees. This also does not increase copper levels significantly. I've used both Regulus and Coopsit, but I actually prefer Coopsit a little bit better because it seems to work a little bit faster and more effectively. But I would use Regulus too if that's all I had on hand. Like everything, prevention is best. It's better to avoid having the problem in the first place instead of trying to deal with it after the fact. So first and foremost, try to avoid yeast stress, such as low nutrients or fermenting at too high of a temperature. Rehydrate yeast with GoFerm and use nutrient additions. Aerate or add oxygen to the must during active fermentation. Again, not after fermentation. We don't want to have an oxidative fault, obviously. But while the yeast is actively fermenting, then you can either aerate or do a pump over if you're commercial, or add oxygen directly, such as through from an oxygen tank into a stone and right into your batch. Select yeast strains that are known for low hydrogen sulfide production. You can read the manufacturers or the supplier of the yeast and which strains have lower sulfide production. Try to avoid leaving on the gross lees for too long. And this doesn't happen immediately. I know some new meat makers are trying to rack off the lees like 2 or 3 weeks. It's not going to happen that fast, but I'd get more worried about it. Once you start getting out 2 months, 3 months, especially if there's a lot of fruit and the lees is, if the lees is only an inch thick, that's one thing. But if it's several inches thick, it's more likely to happen sooner than later. And if you're aging surlees, make sure you stir the lees frequently. Surlees is basically a technique to age on the fine lees. After you've racked off the gross leaves from the fruit and everything, there still will be some sediment from the dead yeast cells as they settle out. So if you do that, make sure you stir the lees frequently. And if you detect hydrogen sulfide at any time, do something about it right away before it converts over to mercaptans or dimethyl sulfide, which are much more difficult to address. That brings us to microbial faults. Now we use yeast obviously to ferment the sugar in our must and to make alcohol. Occasionally we use some of these other bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria, for example, in malolactic fermentation, or when trying to make like a sour or wild fermented mead. Brettanomyces is the same thing. It's a yeast that when you put it in on purpose and you control it, can actually give you some interesting and unique funkiness, but when it's present and you don't want it, then it's a problem. So lactic acid bacteria can cause your mead to smell like sour milk, yogurt, sauerkraut. It tends to be more likely in the wild unselected lactobacillus. If you put in a selected culture of, say, Enococcus to do a malolactic fermentation, that's much less likely to happen. The way to prevent this from happening is proper sanitation, appropriate use of sulfite, and then lysozyme, which I'll talk about a little bit more towards the end of this section. If it happens, there's not much that can be done if it's severe. If minimal, you can sulfite it and blend it, or maybe go with it. Say, hey, I'm going to have a slightly sour mead, and go with it if it's not, that unpleasant. Brettanomyces is a type of wild yeast, and it can cause the mead to smell like barnyard, manure, urine, horse sweat, leather. Some of these compounds are not that unpleasant, and some can be very unpleasant. And the same thing as any other microbial fault, basically proper sanitation, appropriate use of sulfite. And, if it's mild and not unpleasant, maybe you'll just say that's something unique that we did. But if it's pretty severe, then it's probably something that you're going to have to dump. And make sure you don't contaminate other batches. Some of the aroma compounds from Brettanomyces and lactic acid bacteria, some of them are not pleasant. They smell rancid and barnyard, horse blanket. But some, like for example 4-ethyl glycol, have bacon, spice, cloves. So some of these are not necessarily bad in limited amounts, especially if you wanted them to be there because you did a fermentation with Brettanomyces. But if it shows up, you'll say it's showing up in all your batches because you have some contamination issue in your equipment, then of course that's a problem. Acetic acid bacteria. These bacteria, Acetobacter, are used to make vinegar, and so that's ultimately where all wine and mead would end up if nature was allowed to take its course, is it would end up being converted over to vinegar. And this increases volatile acidity, so not just acetic acid, but also ethyl acetic acid. The way to prevent it, again, the proper sanitation, sulfites, and then with acetic acid bacteria in particular, they require oxygen to live and to flourish. So keeping the headspace purged with CO2, in addition to sulfiting to remove dissolved O2, can also be very helpful in managing that. But if it's severe, there's probably not much that can be done. Maybe just let it go its course and have your mead vinegar that if it turns out okay, maybe you can put on your salad dressing or something. Geranium taint. This is described as mead smelling like geranium leaves. I have to be honest, I think this is much worse than geranium leaves. Maybe it's wet, moldy, musty, rotting geranium leaves or something. And the cause of the compound is, or the cause of this fault is sorbic acid is metabolized by lactic acid bacteria, and some people say geraniol, but that's actually a different compound. The actual compound that is causing this is 2-ethoxyhexa-3,5-diene. Prevention is just like you would for any other microbial fault, proper sanitation and sulfites. Don't perform malolactic fermentation on a mead that you're intending to sorbate later. And then using lysozyme, which I will cover here in a second. It can be detected even at very low amounts. So if it's there, it's almost impossible to do anything about once it's there at any detectable amount. The next microbial fault is unwanted in-bottle carbonation. Now, some of us try to make carbonated mead through adding a little bit of priming sugar to the bottle, or sometimes doing the Charmat technique where you add some to the keg. That's controlled and that's done on purpose. What we don't want, though, is if it just starts fermenting and carbonating without us knowing about it, because then it's uncontrolled, and sometimes the corks are pushed out of the bottles, or in worst case scenarios, the bottles just start exploding. And I think almost any of us who have made mead or beer or wine long enough will have had this happen to us, where we're sitting quietly and all of a sudden we hear pow, and bottles in a case start exploding. And if you've ever had that happen, you know that that's something that you never want to have happen again. It can be dangerous, and just even opening these and they can gush all over the place. So basically what happens is yeast, or sometimes other microbes such as bacteria, start working after it has been bottled. Perhaps there wasn't enough sulfite used, or perhaps it wasn't sorbated, and that's one of the preventions, is to make sure that you use sulfite and sorbate if there's residual sugar. Also make sure that your fermentation is completely stabilized before bottling by measuring your final gravity in Brix, and make sure that it hasn't changed for at least several days, if not longer. If it's mild, no off flavors, enjoy as is, preferably quickly. Maybe put it in a cool location, say your fridge, or in a cool basement. But drink it quickly, because what might be mild today may be severe tomorrow. If you do have severe, where you have gushers or exploding bottles, you should safely dispose of those bottles. It goes without saying to wear a personal protective, both eye shield, face shield, so that any shards of glass that may explode towards you are not going to hurt you. If it's reasonably mild and you're not worried about the bottles exploding, one option is you could uncap or uncork and then pour them into, say, a CO2 into a bucket, but still wear gloves and eye protection just in case. Let it sit for a while so that the CO2 can degas off, and then if there's any fermentation going on, let it ferment to completion. And then make sure before you rebottle, you sulfite, and if there's residual sugar, you also sorbate it so that you will stop any future fermentation that could happen down the road in the bottle. If you decide to do that technique, be very careful, because if there's any gushers or exploding bottles, it could be dangerous. So if it's very highly pressurized, it's something I don't generally recommend, but you could do it if it's only mildly carbonated and you want to get rid of that. As I mentioned, one of the ways to prevent in-bottle carbonation is through the use of sulfites. And most of the bacteria and many of the wild yeast are very sensitive to sulfites. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the yeast that we use, are a little bit more tolerant. That's why sulfites alone are often not enough, and we have to add sorbate also to try to prevent in-bottle fermentation. But in general, we aim for a molecular sulfite of at least 0.8 milligrams per liter, and that's determined based on the free SO2 that you measured and also the pH. Again, I covered all of this in great detail in the sulfite and sorbate talk that I have. There are options for control beyond sulfite and sorbate. I mentioned lysozyme. This is an enzyme used to inhibit the growth of gram-positive bacteria, Lactobacillus pediococcus. It has no effect upon yeast, neither on Saccharomyces or on the wild yeast Brettanomyces. It does not have any effect upon acetic acid bacteria. And you can use this in several places. Sometimes a sluggish fermentation, particularly one made with overripe natural fruit, can be sluggish due to activity of bacteria, and so treating with lysozyme will inactivate those bacteria, allowing the yeast to get a head start. It allows for you to use a lower level of sulfite for microbial stability, and by preventing the malolactic fermentation, it also minimizes the formation of biogenic amines, and these are compounds that, like tyramine and histamine, that may be the actual cause of the red wine headache that a lot of people blame on, say, tannins or sulfites, but more than likely it's definitely not sulfites, but it may be these biogenic amines that happens after malolactic fermentation. Other options, chitosan is often used as part of a two-step fining regimen. There is another proprietary formulation of chitosan from fungus, from Aspergillus niger, rather than from shellfish, and it's marketed as a treatment to lower Brettanomyces population. So imagine if you have a barrel program and you're struggling with Brettanomyces, it's hard enough to keep sulfite levels high enough in those barrels to adjust that, and so this may be a way to help manage that. Now, most of us who are home mead makers do not have access to some of these commercial products because of the volume that you would have to order, but as it would turn out, other formulations of chitosan, including the shellfish-derived chitosan, which is the one that we use as a fining agent, may have some effectiveness against Brettanomyces as well. And this is nothing that I have ever personally tried, but it's very interesting, and it might be something that if you happen to have a problem with this, obviously besides sulfiting and proper sanitation, you might try using some chitosan to see if that's going to help you manage this issue in any batches that might be affected. Prevention of microbial faults. A lot of recurring themes here: proper cleaning and sanitation. Try to avoid cross-contamination. If you have some batches that you're doing a wild or sour mead, you have some batches you're doing a malolactic fermentation, and then all your other batches that you're just using yeast, ideally you want to use completely different racking tubes and siphon tubes If you're using like a wine thief or a turkey baster, make sure you sanitize that before you go and get any out, because that's an easy way that you could transfer some of these microbia from one batch to another. Try to keep your vessels completely filled, or at least top off or purge the headspace with an inert gas. Try to avoid excessive use of nutrients. You can use lysozyme to prevent unwanted malolactic fermentation. And then lower pH, less than 3.6, also is unfriendly to microbia. Environmental faults. Location, location, location. One of the more common ones in wine is cork taint, also called TCA, and that stands for 2,4,6-trichloroanisole. These compounds are produced when fungi are exposed to chlorinated phenols. And back in the day, they used to use chlorine to sterilize various things in the wineries, and this resulted in a high amount of cork taint. I read a study where 30 to 40% of bottles had cork taint of wine, and that's obviously a problem. And if you don't know what this smells like, the best description is like a moldy or musty root cellar. And you can detect this in even very small quantities. So prevention really is the only thing you can do about it. Once it develops, it's so easy to detect. There's really not much that you can do about it other than dump it. It doesn't always come from the cork either. It could be from wood pallets in your meadery. It could be from cardboard. It could be from the environment. And that's why I don't use bleach anywhere near where I make mead. I know many of the homebrewing books from back in the day would recommend using bleach, and it is an effective sanitizer, but you have to rinse it, and you don't want to get into anything else. There's other compounds that are associated with the 2,4,6-trichloroanisole. These all have musty or earthy aromas. Some of them are muddy, like geosmin, and some are, quote, musty like a sour dishcloth. Yuck. These are all compounds that can be found in combination with cork taint, and they're obviously all to be avoided. So try to avoid bleach anywhere near where you make mead. And then, most of the commercial sources of corks now are tested for TCA, so most of the cork taint actually doesn't tend to come from the cork anymore, although certainly it could, I guess, depending on where your cork is from. Light strike. On some of the forums, folks have said, "Oh, you can't get the problems with exposure to UV light like you get with a beer because there's no hops in a mead," which is completely true. But you can still have light exposure can still cause problems and some off aromas. It's thought to due to the UV light producing some of the sulfur compounds such as dimethyl sulfide, and so the key is to keep the bottles out of direct sunlight, and then to use dark colored bottles. If you're going to use a clear bottle, and some of the clear bottle meads look beautiful, make sure you keep them in a dark corner, in a closet, or in the box. Heat damage or Maderization. Basically, the mead has a cooked flavor. Y'all have probably heard of Madeira wine, and that's a wine that's been heated, and so you may want that if you're trying to make a Madeira style mead. But for all the others, you don't want to get that cooked flavor, and it's basically excessive exposure to high temperature, so it causes heat damage and premature aging. So keep it in a place where there's not a lot of variation of temperature, and it's reasonably cool, at least not much higher than room temperature. Overuse of additives. More is not always better. Well, some common examples: excess sulfites, the mead smells like burnt matches; excess sorbate, excess nutrients, too much acid or tannins. The acid and tannins I'm going to talk about more, not in this section, but a little bit later on, because they also are how a mead can be out of balance. But I am mentioning them here because, obviously you can get excess acid or excess tannin by adding too much or not measuring carefully. So excess sulfites. The mead smells like burnt matches, and if you don't know what this is like, just get some sulfites, put them in a little bit of glass of water, and just smell it, and you'll know immediately. The cause is basically having added too much sulfite. So either you didn't measure when you added, or you didn't calculate correctly, or you didn't measure accurately. Maybe you were doing a little bit of taste testing before you did your addition, and you kind of weren't paying attention because you were kind of out of it. That's why whenever I do additions of any kind, I make sure that I have not been imbibing in my product, so that I can be completely alert and paying attention. Also remember that if you lower the pH, you will increase the level of free SO2. So if I'm planning on adding acid additions, I'll add it first, then I'll measure my pH and my free SO2, and then determine if I need to add any SO2 based on that new pH and the current SO2. You could actually have a situation where you measure the free SO2, you add an acid, and then you measure the free SO2 afterwards, and it'll actually be up. Even though you did not add more sulfite, there's more free sulfite due to the pH having dropped. I discussed that in much greater detail in my sulfite presentation. So what do you do about it? If it's mild, you can rack it a few times. Remember, sulfites are both volatile and also an oxygen scavenger, so racking it sometimes is enough to make it go away. If it's severe, though, if it's 150 parts per million or more, it's going to be difficult to get rid of it by doing that. Now, you can use H2O2, otherwise known as hydrogen peroxide. This is something that can be done by the home mead maker, but I do not think or do not believe it is legal for commercial mead makers to do. There is a very helpful calculations on how to do this, but you have to be very careful to avoid oxidizing your mead, because hydrogen peroxide is an oxidizing agent. And the amounts that you might add are very small. For example, if you have a 5-gallon batch and you need to drop the SO2 by 30 points, you might be adding 9.3 milliliters, and you're not going to put that hydrogen peroxide straight in that, but you're going to dissolve it in some distilled water, and then pour it in there and then stir it, so make sure that it disperses throughout your batch. And as a last resort, just save your high sulfite mead as a solution to top off or blend with low sulfite meads. A few years back, I had a sweet clover mead that I made a mistake, and I can't remember what the parts per million, I think it was like 200 or 250 parts per million of sulfites. It obviously, there was no fix in that, and and so I used it basically as my sulfite quote-unquote addition, and I eventually used it up over multiple batches, and I used it in batches that needed sulfite. Instead of adding the sulfite powder, I added a certain amount, and I calculated how much to add to bring it up, and I eventually used that 5-gallon batch up. So not the best answer that I wanted, but at least it wasn't, I didn't have to pour it down the drain and waste it completely. Excess sorbate. This has been described as pineapple, celery, or bubblegum, and this is not the same as the geranium taint that would happen from malolactic bacteria acting upon sorbate. This is from the sorbate itself, and some people are supposed to be able to detect it as little as 130 to 150 parts per million. Myself, I'm completely blind. I mix a little solution of this, and I don't even know what it's, and I know there's something off. I know there's something that's there that doesn't belong there, but I can't pick it out and say, oh yeah, that's too much sorbate. But some people are apparently very sensitive to this. So it's important not to over add too much sorbate, but to calculate your addition based on how much alcohol is present and based on the calculators that are available, and then use a scale. For years, mead makers were unaware of using nutrients, and now that most mead makers are aware of it, some of them have been using too much. And so, depending on the nutrient you added, it might be like a chemical off aroma. That might be more from the DAP, diammonium phosphate, or if it's more the organic, like the Fermo, it might be more like a yeasty type of thing. And you basically, you don't want to add. You want to add just enough nutrients for the yeast to have to utilize, but not too much, because if you add too much, not only would you be able to smell them or even taste them, but you also are opening up your mead to have unwanted microbial activity. So other critters, other microbia such as bacteria might come in there and start utilizing those nutrients that were not used by the yeast. So make sure you calculate and measure carefully. If it's still fermenting, maybe all is not lost. Just let fermentation proceed and see how it does. If fermentation is already complete and you can definitely smell or taste the excess nutrients, probably not much can be done. Maybe blend it away. This is a flaw that basically depends on how much is there. So if you can blend it into other batches, the batch that is affected into other batches, eventually it won't be a problem if it's blended away enough. As with all of these flaws, prevention is always best, so be careful in your calculations. Make sure your measurements are accurate. More is not always better. And then if you are going to be doing any additions, maybe don't do it after you've been having a night enjoying the beautiful, delicious mead that you've produced. Maybe write down your calculations and then look at them the next day to make sure that they're accurate. And then use your scale and do it when you're a little bit more with it. Miscellaneous flaws. The many other ways you can make a bad mead. So depending on how bad these are, some of these are relatively minor and easily fixable. That would be like a mead that's slightly hazy. Some can be enough that the mead is really undrinkable. If you have a mead that's like rocket fuel, that might be something that's, maybe you can age it a little bit or, add tannins or something to help subdue it, but it's still not going to be, all that as good as it might be. And then the mead being out of balance, and that's usually fixable, well, at least before it goes into the bottle. You can do a lot of things to try to address that. So rather than clear, the mead is hazy or cloudy. Looks aren't everything. You can have a mead that tastes great and looks a little bit cloudy, and if you're just going to drink it for yourself and you're going to drink it quickly and not, enter a competition, then maybe it doesn't matter so much. Some cloudy mead, however, eventually will form a sediment, and I've seen commercial bottles on the shelf with a centimeter of sediment on the bottom of the bottle, and it was a clear bottle. And for people that don't know what mead is, or that are maybe more used to drinking wine, that's something that most people find unpleasant. I mean, there are situations where hazy mead is acceptable. I mean, many of the session strength meads, it's understood that these are fermented quickly, and a little bit of haziness, they're not going to be aged for a long time. So those meads, a little bit of haziness is perfectly fine. But if you're making anything that you want to store for a long time in the bottle, where you don't want to have sediment, or you want to put in a clear bottle, or you want to enter a competition, and that you really need to pay attention to trying to keep the mead from being hazy or cloudy. Prevention, use a bentonite or other finding agents. If you're using a fruit-based mead, consider using pectic enzyme or some of the other enzymes. Sometimes simply giving enough time and maybe a little bit of cold stabilization will let the yeast and other solids to settle out before racking and then bottling. Consider protein stability testing and other stability testing before bottling. Rack carefully to avoid stirring up the sediment. I think we've all done it. As a new mead maker, I tried to bottle right off of a carboy that had some sediment in it, thinking, if I'm very careful, I won't suck up any of that sediment. Yeah, that doesn't work. You will get a little bit of sediment in each bottle, especially towards the end. So I usually, if there's any sediment, I rack into another carboy or vessel, let it sit for a few days or weeks until there's, and I do that enough times until there's really no sediment on the bottom of the bottle. So if the mead refuses to clear with time, you can wait, just have patience. You can try cold crashing. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It seems to work more if there's any yeast left over or larger particulate matter. It doesn't work so well for some of the finer types of particles that cause haziness. If it's a sizer fruit melomel that may have pectic enzyme, you might add some more, or that might have pectin, you might add pectic enzyme. There's a proprietary enzyme product called Scottzyme KS that is wonderful, especially for some of these nightmare difficult to clear stone fruit, like apricot, peach, and some of these other that are really difficult to clear. The Scottzyme can work very well. Don't do it with the fruit in it, because it's basically going to cause a huge mess by degrading all of the particles in the fruit. So you wait until you're out of primary fermentation, there's no gross fruit present, and you have just a hazy mead that none of the other agents seem to have worked. Or use other finding agents, and I cover this in great detail in my finding agent talk, but consider two-step or counter finding, where you might start with a negative charge finding agent, such as Kiesel sol or bentonite, followed by another agent that has a positive charge. And then finally, you can do filtration. But remember, some of these causes of haziness, such as protein haze, will not respond to filtration. This is only for particulate causes of haziness. Now, sometimes this happened. The mead seemed clear when bottled, but it either became hazy later in the bottle or it formed a dust or sediment in the bottom of the bottle. The cause was, well, it might not have been as clear as you thought it was. I know a lot of new mead makers say, oh, that looks clear, and then they bottle it, and then there's a little bit of sediment in the bottom, and it's a surprise to them, but maybe it wasn't completely clear. There are other instability, protein instability, for example. Perhaps there's microbial activity, a bacteria, lactic acid bacteria started working in the bottle later. Maybe the sulfite levels were too low. And then much less common causes, tartrate and metal instability. I used to think that these were so rare that they never happened in mead, but I've since come to learn that they can happen, so never say never, as the saying goes. But these are more obscure and much less likely in mead as compared to wine. Prevention? Well, first make sure your mead is truly crystal clear before bottling. Properly stabilize with sulfites, and if necessary, if there's residual sugar, also with sorbate to avoid microbial activity in the bottle. And then if you've had problems, do stability testing before bottling and use finding agents if necessary. So how to determine clarity? Well, you could just simply look at it, but that's not quite as good as shining, say, a little laser light or a pen light through a test tube. And if you see a circle of light on one side where the light is, and then a circle of light on the other side, but no cylinder of fogginess in between, then that's clear enough that you probably can bottle. But if you can see that cylinder of light passing through the test tube, then that's not quite clear enough, and you need to do something, either wait or use a finding agent or something. And this is an obvious example of what the test tubes look like before finding and after finding. The mead looked fairly clear to the naked eye in the carboy, but obviously up close with the light, it's very cloudy. Protein stability testing. Protein instability is a common cause of sediment and haziness. For example, you had a very clear mead, and then you back sweetened it with honey. You waited a little bit. It looked kind of clear, so you decided not to fine it with anything, and you bottled it. And later on, maybe several weeks or even months or years later, there's a bunch of sediment in the bottle, and that's often from protein instability. And so there's two ways to test for protein stability. One is with the hot water bath test. A slow cooker or crock pot, I should say, can work really well with that. And you put little sample bottles in there, leave them open so there's not any problem with any pressure from the heating, or let's say it accidentally starts boiling on you, it's not going to blow up the bottle. But you don't want it to heat up to as high as to where it is going to boil, but you never know, and you want to be safe. So you sit them in at around 170, 180 degrees for at least an hour, and then you let them cool slowly to room temperature. They'll be clear to start with, but if they become hazy after they cool to room temperature, that is a positive test. That means there's protein present, and you'll need to use finding agents such as bentonite to address that. Basically, what's happening is the heat exposure is denaturing the protein, sort of like when you have an egg and the egg white is clear, but then you heat it and it becomes like a cooked egg white. So the same thing is happening by heating the mead. Another way to test for protein stability is with ethanol. You can use Everclear. You could use rubbing alcohol, but obviously make sure you don't drink it afterwards. But basically, you do a 1-to-1 mix of the mead, say 10 milliliters of the mead, and then 10 milliliters of the ethanol. And a sediment will typically form almost immediately, so it'll become hazy almost immediately, and then a sediment will settle if you leave it out. And that's also a positive test for protein instability. And again, if you have a problem and this test is positive, then you're going to need to use a finding agent, and most commonly the finding agent we use to prevent protein instability haze is bentonite. Now, these are some uncommon causes of haziness, which I previously thought were so rare as to never happen in mead, but as the old saying goes, never say never. So certain metals can form hazes and deposits called casts. There's ferric or iron casts, which appears after exposure to air and is due to excess iron. And there's cupric or copper cast, which occurs under the opposite conditions, under reductive conditions where there's low oxygen. Sometimes the bottle is, with the ferric cast, the bottle is completely clear, but then you open it and you set it out. and then the next day you look at it and it's turned cloudy, and that would be from ferric or iron cas. So the diagnosis with the iron cas, a small amount of mead is put into a bottle. It's filled halfway, and then you shake it or oxygenate it directly and let it sit for 48 hours. And if it becomes cloudy, then you know you have problems with that. It also can be detected through cold stabilization, so storing it freezing for about a week or so will bring this out. The cupric cas, on the other hand, you can detect that by exposing it to indirect UV light for at least a week, or UV light itself for a few hours, and in a clear bottle, obviously. Or you can store it at a reasonably warm temperature for about 3 or 4 weeks. If it's cloudy, but then you expose it to air and oxygen, it will again become clear in about 24 to 48 hours. Remember that the copper cas happens under reductive, that is low oxygen conditions, so if you expose it to oxygen, the haze that occurred during the positive test should go away, and that will confirm that it's copper. So to prevent the iron instability, you try to avoid sources of iron. Back in the old days, wineries would use like iron pipes and things like that. That's been avoided now. It's known about. So now they're using inert materials such as stainless steel that will not add iron. So the more common sources or other sources, such as a water source high in iron, if you're a home mead maker and you're using well water and it's high in iron, you potentially could get this. So the way you manage it is first expose to oxygen. There's several options. One of the old traditional ways was to first expose to oxygen and then fine with potassium caseinate, but we don't recommend that anymore because you're exposing it to oxygen and you could cause an oxidation flaw. So that was a traditional way of managing this, but it's no longer recommended. Another option is adding some citric acid. Not enough. Citric acid, if you add it as an acid addition, it could give you some unwanted characteristics. It's much more puckery, sour, tart than other forms of acid. If you use citric acid and you're planning on doing a malolactic fermentation, it can be converted to diacetyl and other things. But the amounts that you would use are actually quite low, and so you should never detect it, and it shouldn't really change the pH by much, because you're only using a very small amount, and what that does is chelate the iron, and it forms ferrocitric acid, which is soluble, so that'll prevent you from getting this haze from the iron instability. Another option is to use ascorbic acid as an oxygen scavenger right before bottling. And then the fourth option is gum arabic, which forms a protective colloid, and that basically keeps these little particles together so they don't form a haze and they don't settle out. It's useful for meads and wines that are going to be drunk quickly, drunk young, because it's not a permanent solution, because eventually it will settle out and you will have a sediment from it. So that's sort of a temporary solution for something that's going to not be aged for very long. So for copper instability, try to avoid sources of copper. Some of the older wineries would have copper piping, and there was also copper that was used in the vineyard to treat the grapevines, and that was a source. With mead and meaderies and home mead makers, we really don't have to worry about those sources, but you could add too much copper if you're using copper sulfite as an agent to deal with the reductive flaws, which is yet another reason why I don't recommend copper sulfate but prefer the Regulus or the Cupsid if you're having to use copper to address reductive flaws. One of the treatments was a heat treatment at a relatively high temperature. It's not recommended, obviously, for some of the problems and damage it could cause to your product. Simply using bottles with colored glass. This tends to occur upon exposure to light, and it doesn't even have to be direct light. It could even be if you're a commercial mead maker and you have your bottles of mead sitting on the shelf in a liquor store where the light is on, many hours of a day, that it could potentially be enough to cause you to have this cause of haziness. The copper instability tends to occur more likely in the presence of proteins, so you might use some bentonite, and this is post-fermentation, to both remove these proteins, which can cause protein haze, but also the copper haze. And then a fourth option is the use of gum arabic, again, to prevent precipitation of these compounds by being a protective colloid. But again, this is not a permanent or long-term solution. It's something that can be used for a mead that's going to be drunk fairly young, within a few months or a couple of years at most. Tartrate instability is another cause of haziness that I thought was so uncommon as to never occur in mead, but in speaking with a couple of people, actually, it turns out it can happen. So again, never say never. It's much more common in wine. Any of us that have drank in wine have seen the crystals of quote unquote wine glass in the bottom of the bottle, and that's from tartrate crystals. Some people think the tartrate crystals in the bottom of the wine bottle are a sign of quality, but it really has nothing to do with that. It's just tartrate crystals. So you could have an excellent wine that does not have those crystals, and you could have a poor wine that does have those crystals. It's probably not very common in mead because most mead does not have a high enough tartrate. Even the piments that we make probably does not have enough tartrate to do that. But again, you never say never. If you're making a piment that is really very much like close to a wine, then perhaps that's the situation where it can happen. And the way to diagnose this is through cold stability testing. You store it at freezing or less for several weeks. If you see the crystals, you can taste them. They taste sour. They taste just like tartaric acid. There is another form of tartrate instability that's not potassium tartrate. It's calcium tartrate, and that's not quite as sensitive. The cold stability testing is not quite as sensitive to detecting that. Management? Well, simply storing at cold temps for several weeks to months before bottling. Traditional wineries would store their wine in barrels at cellar temperature, for many months, and so any tartrate that was going to precipitate out usually already did. Sometimes seeding with potassium bitartrate, which at first seems kind of counterintuitive. You're trying to prevent this and you're adding some, but basically by adding it, you're causing the precipitation to occur more quickly during bulk aging, and then you follow it by cold stabilization to encourage the precipitation of these crystals even sooner. And so that way, later when the mead or wine is in the bottle, it's much less likely to happen. There's another product, metatartaric acid, which basically prevents the crystallization of the tartrate, but it gradually loses efficacy over time, so over a few months. So it's something that you could use, to prevent that from happening if the wine's going to be drinking very quickly, or the mead, but it's not something that's going to be very helpful long term. Again, this is a very uncommon cause of haziness in mead, but again, never say never, and I just wanted to mention it to you so that if you have anything weird that I didn't cover earlier in the presentation, at least you have some ideas what you might think about, depending on the type of mead that you made. For the science nerds, like myself, you can also try to look at the deposits, either the deposits at the bottom of the bottle or the sediment, or if it's a haze that doesn't have a sediment, you could centrifuge it out and then look at it under the microscope. There's a website called the Australian Wine Research Institute where I got some of these photos from, and it's a very good website. There's calculators on there. There's some short articles talking about some of the issues, and it's open access, and so I highly recommend that website. But basically, you look at it under the microscope and you try to classify it. Is it a crystal? Does it appear to be some type of microbia, some type of cell of a single cell organism? Is it amorphous? Does it have really no shape whatsoever, or is it in the other category? Here's some photos from that website. There's potassium bitartrate, calcium tartrate, yeast, amorphous deposit, protein, diatomaceous earth, and the bacteria. And so these are all, if you're going to be a science nerd, you don't have to do this. You can address most causes of lack of clarity without having to do this. But again, if you're a science nerd and you're trying to figure out what is happening and why is this happening and what should I do about it to prevent it from happening, you can go through, if you have a microscope, and try to look at what all these hazes are caused by. Okay, enough about clarity. Let's talk about some of the other miscellaneous flaws. This is a common one. The mead is too hot. It's like rocket fuel. And the cause is either you aimed for too high of an ethanol level, or there's a presence of higher or otherwise known as Fusil Alcohols. Prevention, well, try not to, if you're wanting to make a mead with high alcohol, that's fine, but realize it can be hard to make a mead such as that and pull it off without it seeming too hot, than an alcohol burn. Sometimes a little bit more subtlety is better. Fusil alcohols can happen due to yeast stress, so try to avoid too high of a fermentation temperature. Make sure you use enough yeast when you pitch, and use nutrient additions. Solutions, it depends. You can blend it with lower alcohol meads. You could back sweeten. Sometimes can soften the burn, and as well as long-term aging, or even tannins can help mitigate this slightly. Now, Fusil alcohols, otherwise known as high alcohols, are produced along with alcohol as a byproduct of alcoholic fermentation, and it can come directly from sugars or amino acids. And some of them actually may add positive notes. The problem is when there's too much of them or too much of certain ones, it can be unpleasant and make the mead seem hot. Sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish between volatile acidity, ethyl acetate, which is like nail polish remover, and excessive fusels, but the cause is often the same, yeast stress, and they often occur together. And here's a list of some of the Fusil alcohols and some of the descriptions of what type of aroma character and flavor character they can give. And in limited amounts, some of them can actually be beneficial, like the 3-methyl-butanol, otherwise known as isoamyl alcohol. In dessert wines and also dessert meads, it can give you a fruity banana-like character, like cognac. And then on the bottom, the 2-phenyl ethanol is like sweet floral rose, honey, rose water. And so that's pleasant, again, only in a limited amount. If it's too much, then it's going to appear more burning, alcoholic, and hot. Nitrogen additions can affect some of these. So if you're doing a nutrient addition, you can mitigate how high it is, and sometimes you can actually increase. If you use too much nutrients, you can actually increase fusels and esters as well. So that can be a good thing for some of the pleasant ones, like the isoamyl acetate and the ethyl octanoate, but for other situations, it can help minimize it. Okay, moving along, this is a common problem we see in mead competition. The mead seems thin and watery, and it's pretty common in low alcohol meads, session strength meads. Maybe there's not enough residual sugar, there's not enough tannins or polysaccharides, so it doesn't have a lot of body. And so to prevent this, try to look at your recipe and ingredients. There are agents available to improve mouthfeel, such as Opta White or Opta Red, tannins, oak aging. Sometimes back sweetening can help this too. Sometimes carbonation. That's why many session strength meads are carbonated, because without the carbonation they just seem very thin and watery. But you add a little bit of that fullness from the carbonation that will also add to make it seem a little bit more full. This is so mead is out of balance. It's not really a fault. The mead is maybe not undrinkable, but it's just not quite there. And I think that's the difference between a mead that scores in the 30 category in a competition versus something that is scoring in the 40 plus. There might not be a actual fault of any kind. It's just the components just don't fit together quite as good as they possibly could. And a simple way of thinking about balance is to think about these on either side of this equation. So if you have a mead that's too sweet, you could balance it by adding some acid, or you could balance it by adding some tannin. The tannins add astringency and dry out the mouth, so make the perception of sweetness seem a little bit less. Or you could carbonate it. Think about soda pop. When it's not carbonated, it's sweet, it's syrupy, it's not very pleasant. But when the soda pop is carbonated, then it's much more thirst quenching. The alcohol, you might be able to balance that maybe with tannin. I mean, if it was really high alcohol, I don't think you're going to be trying to carbonate it or anything like that. So this is not a perfect way to think about balance, but you sort of think about these as two sides of the same equation. On the other hand, if you have a mead that is too sour, has too much acid, the last thing you're going to want to do is add tannin or carbonate it, because it's only going to enhance that perception of tartness and make it seem even more unpleasant than it would be otherwise. So you might add some sugar to balance a mead that's a little bit too tart. So if the mead is too sweet, syrupy sweet, first you try to prevent that from happening to avoid a stuck fermentation, and always perform tasting trials when back sweetening. And like I already mentioned, you might perform some tasting trials with acid or tannin, see if that will help it, or even carbonation. Worst case scenario, it doesn't seem fixable. You might just save it and use it as a way to sweeten an excessively dry mead. If the acid is too sour, perhaps use a highly acidic fruit or juice. Maybe there's not enough residual sugar to balance. You didn't measure correctly. Maybe you added too much acid. Or you just added the acid based on a recipe without doing a tasting trial. Those can all be causes of this. The way to prevent it, try to be careful when you're using acidic juices or fruits. If you're going to add acid, always do a tasting trial to really dial it in. It's really hard to tell someone how much acid to add based on like a recipe or measurement. It's really going to be all based on how it tastes. We tend to prefer tartaric or malic acid instead of citric acid because those are a little bit less tart. Of course, if I'm making a citrus fruit mead, then the natural acid in that is citric acid. And in that case, if I'm adding an acid addition, I will use either the fruit juice itself or I'll use citric acid in that specific case. So to address it, after you've stabilized it with sulfate and sorbate, you can back sweeten it, and that will help soften and balance the acids. Of course, it only goes so far. It is possible to have like a sweet and sour mead. I've judged quite a few where it was twice out of balance. It was both too sour and too sweet. That might be okay if you're going for that type of thing, but that's not always what you want. Just think about how, like lemonade, that, if you made a lemonade but you didn't add any sugar, it would be like lemon water, lemon juice. It'd be pretty sour, but the sugar helps make it more thirst quenching. Again, if you can't be fixed through back sweetening, or you don't want to do that, then just use it to blend the acidic mead with an excessively sweet mead to help provide the acid addition. Or there is de-acidification. So de-acidification. You can use potassium bicarbonate to lower total acidity or titratable acidity. We tend to avoid calcium carbonate because it can add basically a chalky taste. So that tends to be, we tend to avoid that. But if you need to go more than 2 to 3 grams per liter, decrease it, then it's going to be difficult. There is a double salt de-acidification method that is used in fruit-based wines and meads that have both malic and tartaric acid. It's a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to cover it in this presentation, but it is mentioned and discussed in my acids and pH presentation. Excessive tannins. The mead is astringent and bitter. Quite a few years ago, when I was a new mead maker, there was a recipe, and it said to add, a teaspoon of tannin powder to the mead, and right from the start, and you just added it, and oh my gosh, it was, and the same thing with the acid, and it was so tart and so astringent, and it was a bone dry mead, and it was awful. And because I didn't know that you need to determine how much tannin to add based on a tasting trial, you might not need to add any, or you might only need to add a little bit, and that's going to depend on how the mead tastes when you do a tasting trial. If you left the mead in the oak or in a brand new barrel for too long, that can add too much tannin. Maybe you used a fruit that's naturally high in tannins, or there's not enough residual sugar or alcohol to balance the tannins that you added, or you just made a mistake in measuring how much to add. And as I'm sure you all know, there's different sources of tannins. They come from plants. It can come from the seeds. It can come from the skins, or it can come from oak, or even from the tannin powder that you use to add. So the key to prevent your mead from being out of balance due to too much tannin is, as I already mentioned, both with acid and with tannin additions, always do tasting trials where you compare different levels of addition to see what works best. There really isn't a formula that you can use to figure out how much tannins to use. It's going to depend on the type of tannin that you're using. It's going to depend on how much alcohol is present, how much residual sugar. If you're using oak or in a brand new barrel, taste it regularly to determine when to remove, because once the oak is there, it's harder to get rid of. Solution, if it's a bone dry mead and it's very astringent, you might use sulfite and sorbate to stabilize and then back sweeten to help balance those tannins. You might use fining agents. So you can use the PVPP or you can use gelatin. And so which one you use depends on what the problem is. If it's more of an astringency, if it's more from the an astringency, it dries your mouth out, then gelatin would be preferred because it goes after the high molecular weight tannins that tend to cause that. On the other hand, if the problem is more bitterness, then that's the condensed tannins, the small molecular weight tannins, and that is better addressed with PVPP. In some situations, you may want to use both. Another final option is just to age it. A lot of Big, bold, tannic wines are not meant to be drunk young because it's known that they're going to age over time, and these tannins are going to polymerize and soften over time. And so if you have a mead like that, perhaps it's a big, bold fruit-based mead or one that was in a barrel, there might be a lot of tannin, but that might be okay. That might give it some aging potential. And so you have to really think about what to do about this, depending on what you want your end product to be like. What you ultimately want. You want it to be drunk now, or do you want it to sit for a while and you're patient and you're willing to wait to see if it gets better with time. So basically, when back sweetening or adding tannins or acids, you always determine how much to add based on how it tastes in your glass through tasting trials, and never according to a suggested measurement in a recipe. I can't stress this enough. We judge a lot of meads in competitions that are out of balance, and most of them, they could have been fixed or prevented if the mead maker simply tasted them and adjusted them prior to putting them in the bottle. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation, Mead Flaws and Faults. As I mentioned, prevention is always the best. It's always better to prevent the problem in the first place rather than having to try to figure out what to do after the fact. In order to prevent microbial flaws, always practice good sanitation. Maintain optimal fermentation. Keep your yeast healthy through nutrient additions, aeration and oxygenation during early fermentation, temperature control, pH monitoring and control. If you carry out a good, healthy yeast fermentation, a lot of these flaws won't be a problem. You'll have a nice clean mead post-fermentation, and now you can do other things to make it even better. Monitor sulfite levels and keep them at desired levels. Avoid excess oxygen exposure, especially after fermentation, in order to avoid oxidative flaws. Be careful with your additions. Calculate carefully and measure carefully. Taste and smell your mead throughout the production process. If you detect anything, for example, there's some hydrogen sulfide developing while it's fermenting, do something about it now rather than hoping it's going to get better on its own, because most of the time it won't get better on its own. It'll actually get worse. And then balance mead after fermentation through blending or careful use of additions. And the other thing that I didn't put on here, but taste a lot of mead. Taste other people's mead. If you have the opportunity to go to a competition as a judge or a steward, you'll have a wide variety of examples of mead to try. Good, great, bad, awful, indifferent, mediocre, and try to sample them mindfully, trying to think about what is it here that I'm tasting that I have a problem with, and also in a mead that's really good, try to think about it in a mindful way as also. What do I really like about this? Is it the aroma, the flavor, how well balanced it is? So that concludes this presentation. I have all my references here. I think most of these are open access, so I encourage you not to take my word for anything, but to try to look it up yourself and read and learn from all of these references. They're all very useful if you want to dive into what causes problems and issues in mead even more deep than this presentation is. And I should have a PDF copy of a handout of these slides as well for your own use. And thank you again for watching this series of presentations. I hope you enjoy making good mead. Cheers!